Nobody in country music has survived the way Reba McEntire has survived. And I do not mean that as a compliment dressed up in polite language. I mean it literally. The woman has outlasted trends, record labels, a marriage that was also a business empire, a plane crash that killed 8 of the people closest to her, a decade when Nashville tried to turn her into something she wasn't, another decade when critics decided she had gone too pop, and a moment in 2015 when the man who had managed her career for 26 years walked out and took the entire infrastructure of her professional life with him. Most people would have been finished after any one of those things. Reba McEntire collected all of them, kept moving, and is now hosting a sitcom on NBC, coaching on The Voice, and performing at the Super Bowl. She is 70 years old. And if you have been a country music fan long enough to have heard her first records come over the radio in the early 1980s, if you remember what it felt like when My Kind of Country came out in 1984, and suddenly here was a woman who sounded like she had reached back past all of the strings and production gloss of the urban cowboy era and grabbed country music by the collar and dragged it back to where it belonged, then you already know that the Reba McEntire story is not the one most people tell. The story most people tell is the glossy version, the queen of country, the survivor, the businesswoman, the television star. All of that is true, and none of it captures what actually happened, or what it actually cost, or what it means for the history of this music. So let us tell it properly. Reba Nell McEntire was born on March 28, 1955 in McAlester, Oklahoma, third child of Clark McEntire, a 3-time world champion steer roper who ran a 7,000-acre cattle ranch and spent most of his life proving things with his hands rather than his words, and Jacqueline McEntire, a school teacher who had once dreamed of being a country singer herself and poured every ounce of that dream into her children instead. Reba grew up loading 50-pound sacks of feed into a truck every other day, competing in barrel racing at rodeos across Oklahoma, and singing in the car on long drives with her siblings, Paik and Susie, because the McEntire family believed in that specific Oklahoma way that music was something you did together, not something you watched other people do. She enrolled at Southeastern Oklahoma State University in 1974 to study elementary education with a music minor, because her mother insisted she finish her degree before pursuing music seriously. And she did. She graduated, she fed her father's steers, she ran barrels at 50 rodeos a year, she kept her horse at school, and that same year, 1974, her father told her that if she was going to drive up to Oklahoma City for the National Finals Rodeo anyway, she might as well get herself a job while she was there. The job was singing the national anthem. She sang it. A cowboy singer from Texas named Red Steagall was in the arena that night. He heard her. Her mother cornered him at a hotel party afterward and asked if he could get all 3 of her children into the music business. Steagall told her honestly he was barely staying afloat himself, but he called back in January of 1975 and said he could try with Reba. Just Reba. Her mother packed a bag, drove her daughter to Nashville, and 11 months later, Reba McEntire had a recording contract with Mercury Records. Now here is where the story gets complicated, and here is where the first real debate about Reba McEntire begins. Because what happened in the years between that Mercury Records signing in 1975 and the release of My Kind of Country in 1984 is not just a prologue to her success. It is the most revealing part of the whole story, and it is the part that most people skip over in about 30 seconds when they talk about her career. Mercury Records did not know what to do with Reba McEntire. That is the honest truth. They heard a voice that was extraordinary, raw and direct, and full of that Oklahoma dust and the specific quality that comes from a woman who has spent her life outdoors doing hard work, rather than sitting in a rehearsal room being taught how to perform emotions she hasn't felt yet. And they took that voice and put it inside the same polished, pop-adjacent production that was making the label money elsewhere, because that was what Nashville was doing in the late 1970s, and Mercury was not in the business of being different from what was working. Her first single, I Don't Want to Be a One-Night Stand, came out in 1976. It charted modestly. Her debut album came out in 1977, the same year she made her Grand Ole Opry debut. The records she made for Mercury over the next 6 years were not bad records, but they were not Reba McEntire records. They were the record label's idea of what a young female country singer should sound like in that era. And the distance between that idea and what she actually was, what was actually living inside that voice, was the distance between a photograph of a fire and the fire itself. She charted, she had modest hits, she opened for the Statler Brothers, she opened for Conway Twitty, which was its own education in how to hold a crowd, how to command a stage, how to make a room of strangers feel something before they know your name, but the records were not breaking through the way they should have been, and Reba McEntire knew exactly why, even if Mercury Records did not particularly want to hear it. By 1983, she had had enough. She left Mercury when her contract expired and signed with MCA Nashville. And what happened next is one of the great turning points, not just in Reba McEntire's career, but in the entire direction of country music in the 1980s. Her first album for MCA, Just a Little Love, landed in 1984 with a producer named Harold Shedd at the helm. Shedd pushed toward a country pop arrangement. Again, the same territory she had spent 6 years trying to escape. McEntire made an appointment to see Jimmy Bowen, the newly installed president of MCA's Nashville division. What she did not know when she walked into that office was that Bowen had already made the decision to drop her from the label. He had not heard anything from her that made him think she was going to break through and he was running a business. Then she sat down across from him and told him what she wanted. She said she wanted steel guitar and fiddle. She said she did not want orchestras or violins. She said she wanted to make a record that sounded like the music that had shaped her. Dolly Parton's records, Loretta Lynn's records, Tammy Wynette's records, the women who had paved the road she was trying to walk. She said she wanted to go to the publishing houses herself and find her own songs. Bowen later admitted publicly that he had walked into that meeting planning to drop her. He left it giving her exactly what she asked for. She spent days in the publishing houses with a man named Don Lanier, going through songs one by one, listening for the things she had been looking for her entire career. Material that fit her voice the way a well-made boot fits a foot that has been wearing the wrong size for too long. She found a Harlan Howard song called Somebody Should Leave. She found a John Moffat song called How Blue. She went back to the classics. Ray Price, Connie Smith, Farron Young, Carl Smith, Charlie Pride, and she pulled songs that had been recorded years before and gave them back to the world in her voice. My Kind of Country came out in October of 1984. Billboard magazine called her the finest woman country singer since Kitty Wells. Both singles went to #1. She won CMA Female Vocalist of the Year that year. She won it again in 1985, again in 1986, again in 1987. 4 consecutive years. That had never been done before by a woman in the history of the award. In 1986, she won CMA Entertainer of the Year, one of the very few women in the award's history to ever take that particular honor. The album Whoever's in New England came out that year, and the title track won her a Grammy for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. She was named an official member of the Grand Ole Opry. Her face was everywhere. She was, by almost any measure you could apply, the biggest star in country music. And she built it herself, not by cooperating with what the industry wanted from her, by refusing it, walking across the hall to the label president's office and telling him plainly what she needed. That is important, because it is very easy when you look at the size of Reba McEntire's success to assume that Nashville was always on her side. It was not. Nashville is never on anyone's side until the money starts moving in the right direction. What she did in 1984 was not just make a better record. She made a decision about what kind of artist she was going to be, at a moment when the institution she worked inside would have been perfectly happy for her to make a different decision. And she made it alone, or as close to alone as a person can be when their career is on the line and the man with the power to end it is sitting across a desk from them. Now, let us talk about Narvel Blackstock, because you cannot honestly tell the Reba McEntire story without talking about Narvel Blackstock, and you cannot honestly talk about Narvel Blackstock without acknowledging something that makes a lot of her fans deeply uncomfortable. Narvel Blackstock came into her life as her steel guitarist. He was on the road with her band in the early 1980s. He was eventually her tour manager, then her husband. They married in 1989, a year before their son Shelby was born, and Reba became a stepmother to his 3 children from a previous marriage, Chastity, Shauna, and Brandon. Over the 26 years of their marriage, Narvel took over the management of her career entirely through his company, Starstruck Entertainment, and by most accounts, he was very good at it. The business grew, the brand expanded, the television show, the clothing line, the restaurants, the production company. All of it was built and managed inside the structure of their partnership. And here is the thing that most profiles of Reba McEntire do not sit with long enough. When Narvel initiated the divorce in 2015, after 26 years, what left with him was not just a husband. It was the entire operating system of her professional life. Every member of the management team, every business relationship that had been built through Starstruck, the infrastructure that she had handed over piece by piece across the length of a marriage because she trusted him with it completely. She described it herself in an interview years later. Everybody took care of everything. All she had to do was get up and sing. When that dissolved, she said she was scared to death, deserted, abandoned. left. She was 60 years old. She had not managed her own career in a meaningful sense for over 2 decades. She threw a fit by her own account. And then she got up, built a new team, and kept working. Now, here is where I want to ask a question that I suspect is going to divide the comment section. And I am asking it not to be harsh about Reba McEntire, but because I think it matters for how we understand her story. Was it a mistake to hand that much control of her professional life to one person, and that person being her husband? The women she had named as her models, Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, Tammy Wynette, each of them had complicated relationships with the men who managed or produced them. Loretta had Doolittle, who was by many accounts both her champion and her captor. Tammy had George Jones, then a series of managers and husbands who did not always serve her interests clearly. Dolly, the sharpest businesswoman in the history of country music, possibly the sharpest businesswoman in the history of American entertainment, kept her publishing rights, built her own company, and has never been beholden to any single person for the management of her legacy. Reba McEntire is not Dolly Parton, and that is not a criticism. There is only one Dolly Parton, and the specific combination of business acumen and personal toughness and outright genius that Dolly brought to the construction of her career is not something you can simply choose to emulate. But the question of whether handing complete professional control to a husband, no matter how competent, no matter how trusted, is ever a wise decision for a woman whose name is also a brand, whose creative output is the engine of everything else. That question is worth sitting with. And it is worth sitting with because of what happened in 2015 when that arrangement ended. She rebuilt. That is the part of the story that matters most. At 60 years old, frightened and furious and starting over, she rebuilt it. But let us go back. Let us go back to 1991, because there is a moment in Reba McEntire's story that sits at the center of everything. A moment that shaped who she became in ways that are still visible 34 years later, and a moment that no honest conversation about her can skip past. March 15th, 1991. McEntire and her band had just played a private concert for IBM executives in San Diego, California. She was recovering from a bad case of bronchitis. Her husband, Narvel, and her stylist, Sandy Spica, decided to stay overnight in California rather than fly out with the band to Fort Wayne, Indiana for the next date on the schedule. 2 chartered jets were waiting at Brownfield Municipal Airport. At approximately 1:45 in the morning on March 16th, the first jet cleared the runway, rose into the dark over the Otay Mountains south of San Diego, and flew directly into the side of a mountain. The left wing struck rock first. The plane cartwheeled. It exploded. In that wreckage, tour manager Jim Hammond, band leader and keyboardist Kurt Capello, keyboardist Joey Ciganero, drummer Tony Saputo, guitarist Michael Thomas, guitarist Chris Austin, bassist Terry Jackson, vocalist Paula K. Evans, and the 2 pilots Donald Holmes and Christopher Hollinger. 10 people, dead in the dark, on the side of a mountain a few miles south of the border in the early hours of a Saturday morning. Narvel came back to the hotel room at 2 or 3 in the morning. He told her one of the planes had crashed. She asked if they were okay. He said he didn't think so. She said, "But you're not sure?" He said, "I don't think so." She has said publicly that she did not know in the days that followed if she was going to be able to continue. That is not a figure of speech. She genuinely did not know if she could go back. 8 of the people she saw more than almost anyone else in her life, the people she shared a bus with, a stage with, 100 cities with, were gone in a night. The families of those people had to be notified. The funerals had to be attended. The world had to be faced. 9 days after the crash, she was scheduled to perform at the Academy Awards. She had been booked to sing an Oscar-nominated song called "I'm Checking Out" from the film Postcards from the Edge. She did it. She stood on that stage 9 days after burying 8 people she loved, and she sang. She said later that she heard her tour manager Jim Hammond speaking to her in that moment. She said she heard him saying, "Go do it for us. We're checked out of this heartbreak hotel." She did it for them. 8 months later, she released For My Broken Heart, the album she wrote out of that grief. It is the best-selling album of her career. Not the commercial peak. Whoever's in New England was probably that. But For My Broken Heart is the album that shows you the most about who Reba McEntire actually is, because it is the album she made when she had the best excuse in the world to make nothing at all. And instead of making nothing, she turned the worst year of her life into 12 songs that her audience could put on and feel something true inside. That is not a career calculation. That is a human being doing the only thing she knew how to do with pain that had no other place to go. Vince Gill called her after the crash and said, "Buddy, I'll be there for you. If you want me on your stage, I'll be there." Dolly Parton called and said, "Take my band." Dolly Parton offered her band. Those are the moments that reveal what the community of country music actually looks like at its core, underneath the business and the competition and the awards show politics. A group of people who, when one of their own is on the ground, show up. Now let us talk about something that the people who discovered Reba McEntire in the 1990s, the people who love her without reservation, say she expanded. They say that an artist with her ability was never going to be content with one lane, that the sitcom and the acting and the television hosting were all expressions of the same fundamental talent. A woman who can make you feel something in any room, in any medium, in front of any audience. They say that the expansion of her brand made it possible for more people to discover the music, and that every person who found Reba through the sitcom eventually found their way back to My Kind of Country and What Am I Gonna Do About You and For My Broken Heart. The people who are more skeptical say something different. They say that the second half of her career, for all of its business success, has not produced records of the weight and specificity of the early work. They say that the woman who walked into Jimmy Bowen's office in 1984 and demanded steel guitar and fiddle would not entirely recognize the brand architecture that her name sits inside now. They say that the line between expanding your artistry and expanding your market share is not always as clean as it looks from the outside, and that Reba McEntire has sometimes crossed it in a direction that served the second more than it served the first. I do not think there is a clean answer to that debate. What I think is true is that the question itself reveals something important, which is that Reba McEntire has always been two things at once. She has always been the Oklahoma ranch girl who loaded feed sacks and ran barrel races and sang hymns in the car with her family, and she has also always been one of the most strategically intelligent artists country music has produced. Those two things coexist inside her. They have coexisted since the moment she sat down across from Jimmy Bowen and told him what she needed. The authenticity and the ambition have never been separate. They have always been the same engine driving the same vehicle in the same direction. And what that has produced, across 50 years of recording and performing, across 25 number one singles, across 75 million records sold worldwide, across a career that has gone from a rodeo anthem in Oklahoma City to the Super Bowl halftime show, is something that country music does not produce often and should not take for granted. It has produced a survivor, not in the soft, inspirational poster sense of that word, in the specific, documented, measurable sense. A woman who was told by a label that her voice was the problem, who went to Nashville twice before it worked, who watched 8 of her people die in the dark on a mountain and got on a stage 9 days later, who lost a 26-year marriage and the professional infrastructure that came with it at 60 years old and rebuilt from the ground up, who has been counted out by critics, by trend watchers, by the industry itself on multiple occasions and come back each time not with a statement about her resilience, but with a record, a show, a performance, a new chapter. The debate about where Reba McEntire sits in the hierarchy of country music's greatest women is one that will not be settled in this video. Loretta Lynn wrote her own story with a pen that nobody else had ever picked up. Dolly Parton is a category unto herself, so far beyond the normal measures of country music greatness that comparing anyone to her is almost unfair to both parties. Tammy Wynette sang with a pain so specific and so naked that it still stops people cold 50 years later. What Reba McEntire brought to that conversation and has sustained across a span of time that none of those women were given to match, because none of them lived as long in the public eye as Reba has lived, is something that is harder to name but no less real. It is the quality of a woman who has never once in 50 years of public life appeared to be pretending. Not the emotion, not the faith, not the grief, not the anger, not the fun. Whatever Reba McEntire is feeling in a given moment, that is what comes out of her, and she has never seemed particularly interested in cleaning it up before it arrives. She told an interviewer in 2025 that when the divorce happened, she threw a fit. Scared to death, she said, deserted, abandoned, and left. And then she laughed when she said it, because she had come through it, and she knew she had come through it, and she was not going to dress it up in gracious language when the plain version told the story better. That is Reba McEntire. The whole career in one moment, the pain stated plainly, the survival evident, the laughter at the end because she is still here and she knows it and she is not going to pretend otherwise. So, where does she belong in the history of country music? Tell me what you think. Tell me if you believe she's the greatest female country artist of her generation. Full stop, no asterisk. Tell me if you think the pop crossover of the 1990s and the television career and the brand expansion cost her something artistically that she never fully got back. Tell me if you think For My Broken Heart is the most important album a woman made in country music in the decade of the 1990s, or if you think Loretta and Dolly and Tammy, had they been given those same years, would have made something more enduring. Tell me if what she did in 1984, walking into Jimmy Bowen's office and refusing to be dropped, refusing to be polished, refusing to be turned into the thing the label wanted, deserves to be in the same conversation as what George Strait was doing at that same moment, what Randy Travis was building, what the new traditionalist movement owed to the artists who had the courage to demand it before it was commercially safe to do so. Tell me where Reba McEntire sits for you, because she has spent 50 years earning the right to be talked about this way, and the least we can do is take the conversation seriously. The comment section is right there. Thank you for watching.